Nigeria Airways Flight 2120. On July 11, 1991, a Douglas DC-8 operating as Nigeria Airways Flight 2120 left Jeddah with 247 passengers and 14 crew. Minutes later, the aircraft was on fire. Systems were failing, and within sight of the runway, it broke apart, killing all 261 people on board. It remains the deadliest crash of a DC-8 and the worst accident in the history of a Canadian airline. The disaster began on the ground. Mechanics had already flagged that the number 2 and number 4 tires were dangerously underinflated. With no nitrogen available to refill them, a product manager brushed the problem aside to keep the schedule moving. The cost of the choice was catastrophic. On takeoff, the overstrained number 1 and number 2 tires failed, metal scraped the runway, and heat built into a self-sustaining fire. The crew didn't know flames were spreading beneath them because the DC-8 had no wheel well fire sensors. They saw circuit failures, pressurization problems, and smoke. The 47-year-old captain, William Allen, a seasoned pilot with 10,700 flight hours, tried to keep control, while First Officer Kent Davidge reported hydraulic and aileron failures. Flight Attendant Kay Smith rushed in with the words no pilot wants to hear: "Smoke in the back. Real bad." Inside the cabin, passengers were choking on thick smoke. Flames melted emergency exits and even seatbelts. As the fire ate through the cabin floor, people were literally falling out of the aircraft mid-flight. The captain's final transmission was grim. "Require emergency vehicles immediately. We have a fire. We will be ground evacuating." Seconds later, the aircraft disintegrated 1.8 miles short of the runway. Investigators later uncovered falsified tire logs, ignored warnings, and corporate pressure that traded safety for speed. Nation Air Canada collapsed 2 years later, drowning in $54 million in debt. Its owner later convicted of fraud. The crash stands as a brutal lesson in what happens when management gambles with human lives and loses 261 of them in one morning. Loftleiðir Flight 001. On the night of November 15, 1978, a Douglas DC-8 63CF named Leifur Eriksson carried 262 people on a Hajj charter from Jeddah to Surabaya, with a stop in Colombo, Sri Lanka. On board were 249 passengers, mostly Indonesian pilgrims, and 13 Icelandic crew members. Thunderstorms and wind shear surrounded the airport as controllers cleared the flight for a landing on runway 22. The descent began normally, but communication lapses and radar instructions set the aircraft dangerously low. At 23:27:26, the tower cleared it to land, reporting the plane was only 650 feet above ground and just 2 miles from the runway. 11 seconds later, the crew confirmed, "Roger." What they didn't know was that they were already sinking into danger. Seconds later, the approach controller spotted the DC-8 undershooting and warned, "You are too low," but the crew was tuned to another frequency and never heard the words. At 23:28:03, the left wingtip sliced through coconut trees, the fuselage cartwheeled across a plantation, and the aircraft broke into 6 pieces. Flames lit up the night sky just 1.1 nautical miles short of the runway. The toll was devastating. 183 dead, including 175 passengers and 8 crew members. Yet, remarkably, 79 people survived, 47 uninjured, and 32 injured but alive. Rescue efforts were slowed by thick coconut groves that blocked heavy equipment, forcing firefighters to reach the wreckage on foot. The investigation sparked international disputes. Sri Lankan authorities blamed crew error, but American and Icelandic investigators pointed to faulty airport equipment and air traffic control mistakes. What is certain is that this was the deadliest crash involving an Icelandic airline and the second worst in Sri Lanka's aviation history. For the families of those 183 souls, the tragedy was not just numbers. It was the end of a pilgrimage that never reached home. Japan Airlines Flight 715. On September 27, 1977, Japan Airlines Flight 715, a McDonnell Douglas DC-8 62H, was closing in on Subang Airport near Kuala Lumpur after a long journey from Tokyo with a stop in Hong Kong. On board were 69 passengers and 10 crew members. Many headed for Singapore as their final destination. The weather over Malaysia was unforgiving. Thick clouds, poor visibility, and rain shrouded the approach. Controllers cleared the crew for a landing on runway 15, and the descent began. Flaps extended, landing gear locked. Everything seemed routine until the aircraft dropped below its minimum descent altitude of 750 feet. Still without the runway in sight, the captain continued lowering the DC-8. At just 300 feet, the jet plowed into a hillside near Almina Estate, about 4 miles from the airport. The aircraft broke apart. Fire tore through the wreckage, and rescue crews raced through plantation roads to reach survivors. The crash claimed 34 lives, 8 crew members, and 26 passengers. But against the odds, 45 people survived, though most suffered injuries. It was Malaysia's second deadliest air disaster at the time, overshadowed only months later when another crash took 100 lives aboard Malaysian Airlines System Flight 653. Investigators later determined that the captain's fatal error was descending below the legal altitude without the runway in sight. The poor weather obscured visual cues, but regulations were clear: hold until the runway appears. The first officer, bound by cockpit hierarchy, failed to challenge the violation. The silence sealed the fate of 34 people. Decades later, pieces of the wreckage were still found buried in the soil of Elmina Estate, long after the land was cleared for new developments. A memorial now stands in the Japanese cemetery in Kuala Lumpur, carrying the names of those who never made it to Singapore. Cubana de Aviation Flight 455. On October 6, 1976, Cubana de Aviation Flight 455, a Douglas DC-8 lifted off from Barbados bound for Jamaica carrying 73 people, 48 passengers, and 25 crew. Just 11 minutes into the climb, 2 bombs detonated, one in the rear lavatory and another in the passenger cabin. The first severed vital control cables. The second ripped a hole in the fuselage and sparked a fire. The captain's final radio call was urgent and chilling. "We have a fire on board. We are requesting immediate landing. We have a total emergency." But the aircraft never made it back. It plunged into the Caribbean Sea about 5 miles off the coast of Bridgetown. No one survived. Among the victims were 24 members of Cuba's national fencing team, fresh from winning gold medals at the Central American and Caribbean Championships. Most were teenagers, their careers just beginning. Also lost were 11 Guyanese, including 5 medical students headed to Havana, the wife of a diplomat, and 5 North Korean officials. The death toll left Cuba in mourning and shocked the Caribbean. The investigation quickly pointed to anti-Castro exiles. 2 Venezuelans, Freddy Lugo and Hernan Ricardo Lozano, planted the bombs before stepping off in Barbados. They confessed, naming CIA-linked operatives Luis Posada Careles and Orlando Bosch as masterminds. Declassified CIA files later revealed that as early as June 1976, U.S. intelligence had concrete advance warnings of a plan to bomb a Cuban airliner. Trials dragged on in Venezuela. Lugo and Lozano were sentenced to 20 years each. Bosch was acquitted and later pardoned in the United States. Posada escaped prison and resurfaced years later in Florida. For Cuba, the tragedy became a symbol of terrorism tolerated for political ends. Monuments now stand in Barbados and Guyana, honoring the 73 lives stolen in an attack that reshaped Caribbean history. Martinair Flight 138. On December 4, 1974, Martinair Flight 138, a Douglas DC-8 55CF, was on a charter carrying 182 Indonesian Hajj pilgrims and 9 crew members from Surabaya to Jeddah, with a planned stop in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Operated by Martinair on behalf of Garuda Indonesian Airways, the jet had logged more than 35,000 flight hours and was cleared for descent into Colombo just before 5 p.m. local time. The sequence of instructions from air traffic control was confusing. First cleared to 5,000 feet, then 8,000 feet, and finally brought down to 2,000 feet. The aircraft was set on a dangerously low path through the mountains. Without the runway in sight, the crew depended heavily on the DC-8's Doppler and weather radar systems, tools that left too much room for misinterpretation in complex terrain. At 4,355 feet, the aircraft slammed into the Sapta Kanya mountain range, about 40 miles east of Colombo. The impact destroyed the jet instantly, leaving no survivors among the 191 on board. At the time, it was the second deadliest aviation accident in history, behind the Turkish Airlines DC-10 disaster in Paris earlier that same year, and it remains the deadliest crash in Sri Lanka's history. For Indonesia, it meant an entire group of pilgrims, families and elders, perished on their journey to one of the most sacred events of their lives. Eyewitnesses reported the sound of engines running smoothly moments before a deafening explosion echoed across the valleys. Search teams later found debris scattered across the mountain slopes, with no indication of mechanical failure. The official conclusion was stark: controlled flight into terrain, caused by crew misjudgment and poor positional awareness. Memorials now stand in Norton Bridge, Sri Lanka, and at Lelystad Airport in the Netherlands, a somber reminder of a tragedy that marked aviation history with 191 lost lives in a single moment. Japan Airlines Flight 446. On the night of November 28, 1972, Japan Airlines Flight 446 lined up on the runway at Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow. The sleek McDonnell Douglas DC-8 named Haida and only 3.5 years old carried 76 souls bound for Tokyo, most of them Japanese. At 7:51 p.m., the aircraft lifted off the snowy ground, climbed just 330 feet, and within 30 seconds, it was back on the ground, this time in flames, 490 feet beyond the runway. The cockpit voice recorder captured a haunting sequence. V1 at 129 knots, rotation at 145 knots. Then at 154 knots, spoiler! A mechanical sound was followed by confusion, shouts about an engine, and finally, silence. Survivors later recalled violent vibrations, luggage tumbling from overhead bins, and then a sickening drop. When the jet slammed down, 62 people perished, leaving only 14 survivors, most seated in the forward cabin. The investigation pointed to several possibilities. The accidental deployment of ground spoilers, devices meant only for landing, combined with a dangerously steep nose-up climb. Ice buildup may have starved the engines of thrust, compounding the disaster. The DC-8 had no midair air brake safeguards at the time, and after this crash, modifications were introduced to prevent spoilers from being deployed in flight. Flight 446 carried grim irony. Just weeks earlier, Haida had been offered to hijackers during a standoff in Tokyo, and 2 years before, it ferried passengers from another hijacking. Its life ended violently, written off far sooner than any of JAL's other DC-8s. Public outrage was sharp. Japan Airlines had already suffered multiple accidents that year, and critics branded it the floppy flag carrier. Newspapers and even comic strips mocked its reputation. Yet beneath the ridicule was heartbreak. 62 lives gone. Their journey ended less than a minute after takeoff. Japan Airlines Flight 471. On June 14, 1972, Japan Airlines Flight 471 was nearing the end of its long leg from Bangkok to New Delhi, part of a globe-spanning route that started in Tokyo and was bound for London. The aircraft, a Douglas DC-8 named Akan and registered JA8012, carried 89 people, 78 passengers, and 11 crew members. At 2:43 p.m. UTC, the crew was cleared for a straight and instrument landing on runway 28 at Palam International Airport. Moments later, the jet struck the banks of the Yamuna River, just short of the runway, erupting in devastation. The crash killed 86 of the 89 occupants, including 10 of the 11 crew members and 76 passengers. Among the victims were 16 Americans, the Brazilian actress Leila Diniz, and Dr. KKP Narasimha Rao, an Indian senior official with the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. A cabin attendant who perished was the sister of famed Japanese performer San Yute and Rakuvi. The tragedy didn't stop at the aircraft. 4 people on the ground were also killed as the DC-8 broke apart across the riverbank. Only 3 passengers survived, all badly injured. What followed was a bitter dispute. Indian investigators declared it pilot error, accusing the captain of pressing ahead without a clear view of the runway while his first officer handled the approach. Japanese authorities, however, argued the possibility of a false glide slope signal, suggesting the crew may have been misled by faulty guidance from the airport's landing system. The Akan had been in service for just 2 years when it was destroyed. For Japan Airlines, this was part of a string of disasters in the early 1970s, a period when its reputation was battered by repeated accidents. For the families of the 90 dead, including those on the ground, the debate over fault mattered less than the sudden and irreversible loss. Alitalia Flight 112. On the night of May 5, 1972, Alitalia Flight 112, a Douglas DC-8 named Antonio Pigafetta, was making its approach to Palermo after departing from Rome. Aboard were 115 people, 108 passengers, and 7 crew members, many returning home to vote in Italy's national elections. At 10:23 p.m., while descending through clouds and light winds, the jet struck Mount Longa, just 3 miles southwest of Palermo Airport, hitting the ridge at 1,980 feet, barely 300 feet below the peak. The aircraft disintegrated across a 2.5-mile stretch, and a fiery glow lit the mountainside. There were no survivors. The victims reflected a cross-section of Italy's political, cultural, and civic life. Among the dead were film director Franco Indoniva, Palermo Deputy Attorney General Ignazio Alcamo, journalist, lawyers, and even Sestino Vicpalek, son of Juventus's head coach. A Belgian stewardess, 3 British travelers, and a French couple were the only foreigners aboard. The toll left 98 children orphaned and 50 spouses widowed, turning a routine flight into a national tragedy. Official investigators blamed pilot error, a textbook case of controlled flight into terrain, but doubts quickly grew. Some families pointed to reports of the DC-8 being on fire before impact. Others cited a missing black box record, radar data that mysteriously vanished, and even suspicions of a bomb on board. Years later, whispers of mafia involvement, ties to far-right political groups, and even unexplained military activity added darker layers. In 2012, photos surfaced suggesting possible bullet holes in the wreckage, reigniting calls for truth. As recently as June 2023, victims' families were still pressing the Italian state to reopen the investigation. Flight 112 remains Italy's deadliest single aircraft accident, casting a shadow that lingers more than 5 decades later. An open wound where official explanations have never silenced lingering doubts. Swiss Air Flight 316. On the evening of October 7, 1979, Swiss Air Flight 316, a McDonnell Douglas DC-8 named Yuri, was making its landing into Athens after departing Zurich. The aircraft carried 154 people, including 142 passengers and 12 crew members. As it touched down on runway 15L at a speed of 146 knots, the approach was too fast and too far down the strip. The crew failed to properly use braking systems and reverse thrust, and the jet tore past the end of the runway, plowing onto a public road. The left wing and tail separated, fire ignited, and within minutes, the DC-8 was engulfed. The toll was devastating. 14 passengers died and 10 more were injured, though 140 survived. Among those on board were 100 doctors traveling to a medical convention in China, and among the survivors was Hans Morgenthau, the renowned University of Chicago professor and international relations expert. What truly stunned authorities came after the fire was contained. Hidden in the wreckage was more than 1,000 pounds of radioactive isotopes and a small amount of plutonium carried in the luggage of one of the doctors. For a brief, tense period, the plutonium was missing, prompting emergency radiation checks on fire crews and rescue workers. Adding to the chaos, the cargo hold had also contained over $2 million worth of uncut industrial diamonds bound for Bombay, most of which were destroyed in the inferno. Greek prosecutors quickly acted. Just 2 days after the crash, Captain Fritz Schmutz was charged with manslaughter. In 1983, both Schmutz and First Officer Martin Duringer were convicted of negligence and sentenced to prison terms of 5 years and 2.5 years. Though later reduced to fines, neither man ever returned to flying. The cause was clear: a non-stabilized approach, excessive speed, and poor use of emergency systems. Errors that turned a routine stopover into a disaster with international fallout.